Good evening, human geographers, and tonight we begin our second lecture from our religion chapter, and tonight is purely about universalizing religions. So before we get started, I want to reiterate that when we're talking about religion, we're purely looking at the facts, we're looking at it from a geographic standpoint. So one human geography teacher that I know described this portion, this lecture, and our next lecture, almost kind of like baseball cards. All right, we're going to look at the major facts, figures, stats, components, all those different types of things, and that's what we're doing. We're just looking at the facts. We're not getting into right, wrong, indifferent. But just like a baseball card, you're not going to be able to fit everything that is important about a particular religion on the back of a baseball card. All right. So it is important to note that there are a lot of subtleties and nuances that, because of lack of time, we're unable to get to. But let's get started. Before we even begin with the specifics of these different religions, I want to review what is a universalizing religion. Go back. What are the major points? If you had to define a universalizing religion right now, how would you define it? Because here was our textbook definition. A religion that claims global truth and applicability regardless of ethnicity or culture group and seeks the conversion of all people via evangelism and missionary work. So, here are the major universalizing religions that we're going to look at. We're going to look at them in chronological order, in order in which they come into onto the scene as far as human history goes. So we begin with Buddhism, then we will look at Christianity and Islam. So to begin with, each of these religions has a textbook definition that goes with it, but as I was just mentioning, there's no way that you're going to get all of the subtleties and nuance of these different religions into just a single definition, but here we go. Buddhism, a universalizing religion, primarily of Eastern and Central Asia, based on the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama and characterized by the belief that enlightenment would come through knowledge, especially self-knowledge, elimination of greed, craving, and desire, complete honesty, and never hurting another person or animal. So a little background as far as how Buddhism comes into existence in human history. We mentioned there in the opening or in the definition Siddhartha Gautama, who was born right around 563 BCE, that is before the Common Era. And Siddhartha was a son of a lord, so very, very wealthy, very privileged lifestyle. At the age of 29, Siddhartha left his very privileged, sheltered life and for 6 years meditated in a forest in India. Renounced all of his possessions, gave everything up, and for 6 years meditated in a forest in India. And eventually, after 6 years of meditation under the Bodhi tree, Siddhartha attained enlightenment and became Buddha, the enlightened one. And then spent the rest of his life, the next 45 years, preaching across India, spreading his teachings across India. So that's a little bit of background. So let's get into the specifics of the religion, some of the characteristics of our baseball card, as it were. Alright, so this is an image looking at some of the sacred sites for Buddhists. And if you'll take a look, notice what all of them have in common. So while you're taking a look at some of those specific things, I want to point out that Buddha was born in southern Nepal. He was born Siddhartha, but was born in southern Nepal, though most of the events in his life that now represent sacred sites for Buddhists were actually in northern India. So a lot of times you're going to hear the hearth of Buddhism was southern Nepal, northern India, or some combination of the two. So you just kind of have to be aware. And as always, if we're talking about a multiple choice question, got to choose the best option. But if you take a look at these 8 different sacred sites in northern India, southern Nepal, they all have one thing in common: Buddha. They all relate to events in Buddha's life. And that is something that is characteristic of many universalizing religion, is that sacred sites typically correspond to major events in the life of the founder. Alrighty, so let's get into some of those specifics as far as what it would be our baseball card. All right, there are several different religious texts that correspond with Buddhism that you may see associated with Buddhism. The Tripitaka is the word of Buddha, so it's actually some of his actual teachings and things like that. So that's one example. As far as the Mahayana branch, you have the Sutra and things like that. So those are some of the major holy texts and religious texts that are corresponding with it. All right. One major element of Buddhism is reincarnation, which is actually borrowed from Hinduism. And there's actually a lot of, well, not a lot, but there is some overlap between Hinduism and Buddhism, because Siddhartha was born Hindu and renounced the caste system that was a major part of Hinduism. But there are some elements that remain, reincarnation being one of them. And we'll get into kind of the part of reincarnation here in just a couple minutes. One of the things that we will do as we go through this unit is look at some major symbols that correspond with these religions. That way, if you were to see that symbol, for example, in the cultural landscape or something like that, you would know, oh, okay, this is going to be associated with Buddhism or Christianity or Islam, things that might be identifiable for us. And as far as Buddhism is concerned, the wheel of Dharma is that. And one thing that I want to point out is that the wheel of Dharma has 8 spokes. You can see that there, the 8 spokes of the wheel of Dharma. And that corresponds with something that we're going to mention here in just a moment, which is the Eightfold Path. Right? Before we look at that, we have to mention the Four Noble Truths. And this was a major element of Buddhism. And so here are the Four Noble Truths. The first is the truth of suffering, that life is suffering. So first off, we have to point out that something exists, suffering exists. Okay. The second noble truth is the truth of the cause of suffering. What causes that suffering? Well, according to Buddha, the cause of suffering was craving and desire and greed and seeking out more and wanting more or wanting something else, all right, rather than being content, happy with what one has. The third noble truth was the truth of the end of suffering. So first is that something exists. Second is why it exists. Okay, the next one is, okay, how do you end it, right? And the answer was that when someone stops desiring something else, when you stop craving something else, then suffering ends. Well, that's easier said than done. How do you do that? And that's the fourth noble truth. The fourth noble truth is the truth of the path that frees us from suffering. And that path, you might have guessed, is the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path looks at the things that one must do in order to end that suffering. And this is, again, where reincarnation comes in, is because as someone is moving along through these Four Noble Truths and through this Eightfold Path, reincarnation is brought in, and someone is reincarnated as they progress through these Four Noble Truths and attempt to achieve enlightenment, becoming one with Buddha. So the Eightfold Path is made up of 8 things that one must do or have in balance as they work along this to end suffering. And so those 8 elements are, and these represent those 8 spokes on the wheel of Dharma: right view or right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right contemplation or concentration. Right? And those are things where it's not necessarily right and wrong as it is making sure that it's in line, in balance, equilibrium, not desiring too much and things like that. So making sure that there is balance. That's more what it was about. And so the final element to our baseball card, to keep this analogy going, is again elements of the cultural landscape, things that might be identifiable for us, and architecture is always a good one. All right, and so there's two major types of architecture that we should be familiar with as far as Buddhism is concerned, and those are stupas, and stupas are kind of a dome with a spire on top, and those typically house a relic of Buddha. And then pagodas. Now, pagodas developed out of stupas once Buddhism diffused to China and Japan. So something a bit more characteristic of East Asia rather than the South Asian hearth. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the different branches of Buddhism. So the worldwide distribution is about 400 million people, but that's kind of difficult to accurately count because, for example, China is officially atheist, but has many people who are Buddhist, but at the same time, someone might be Buddhist as well as Confucianist. It makes it a little bit more challenging as far as accurately getting the number of people who are actually Buddhist. All right. So as far as the major branches, we have a few that we have to be familiar with. Theravada is about 38%. You'll see it largely in Southeast Asia. Theravada translates to roughly the way of the elders, and kind of very similar to perhaps what Buddha's original way of life would be, renouncing his possessions, becoming a monk, stressing meditation, and things like that. Mahayana Buddhism translates to the bigger raft or the bigger ferry. And more than half of the world's Buddhists identify as Mahayana, and it's largely in East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and is very much an element of what makes Buddhism a universalizing religion, seeking to help all people, citing Buddha's compassion and charity towards others. And then the final branch, Vajrayana, sometimes called, or I've seen it in the past, Tatrayana, is more associated with, or I've also seen it as Tibetan Buddhism. Now we're getting into some areas where there's some discrepancy. Definitely the smallest branch of Buddhism, only 6%, largely found in Tibet, but is most well known because of an individual that you might have heard of before and is associated with Buddhism, the Dalai Lama. And so this is another element where we can incorporate that into our understanding, right? Knowing who an individual is and what religion they're associated with is important. So let's go ahead and take a look at our map of Buddhism and its spatial distribution. All right. Notice there, I have a note up there that says it isn't widely practiced in the place where it began. And so I want to ask you guys, what is being practiced where Buddhism began? Remember, Siddhartha was born in southern Nepal. Most of the events that inspired or are now sacred sites for Buddhists are in northern India. So what religion is now widely practiced in the area that Buddhism began? So that's a question that I have for you. And Dora wants to know the answer too. And taking a look at our map, how could we describe the spatial distribution currently of Buddhism? Where it diffused to and how would we describe the current distribution? We listed some countries on the last slide, but as far as regions, how would we label that? In addition to that, we could ask, again, different, another map looking at Buddhism. This is now looking at different branches of Buddhism. We have Theravada, Mahayana, and the diffusion of this. Now, in this case, they have the Tibetan Buddhism, which does take some elements of Mahayana. It takes part of the Vajrayana branch, so there is some crossing over of that there. Notice the map that we have here, and as always, let's ask the questions that we want to ask. What type of map are we looking at, and at what scale are we analyzing? Let's take a moment, answer those. Alrighty, shifting gears now to our next universalizing religion, again in chronological order, we're looking at Christianity. Christianity, our definition is a monotheistic, universalizing religion based on the teachings of Jesus Christ and of the Bible as sacred scripture. According to Christian teaching, Jesus is the Son of God, placed on earth to teach people how to live according to God's plan. So, continuing with the same kind of progression that we looked at with Buddhism, let's start with the origin. How did this come onto the scene as far as human history is concerned? And it begins with Jesus being born in Bethlehem right around the BCE CE changeover. There's some disagreement as far as the exact year. Some say it's 8 BCE. Some will say 4 BCE. Remembering that BCE is before Common Era. And then Jesus died in Jerusalem in the year 30 of the Common Era. And Christians believe that Jesus died for human sins and was resurrected by God. And that's going to be important in our understanding of Christian ideology and things like that as we take a look at it. So let's get started with that. Once again, as far as our baseball card is concerned, let's look at a couple different elements. Christianity, the holy text is the Bible. And there are 2 major books of the Bible. You have the Old Testament and the New Testament. And there is a connection here with Judaism because the Old Testament of the Bible is based on Jewish religious text. And then the New Testament is Jesus' life and the miracles that he performed and things like that. So 2 major elements of it, but that's kind of what we're looking at. Other major elements in Christianity are the 7 sacraments. So let's run through what those are very quickly. The 7 sacraments, I'll go kind of in an order here. Beginning with baptism, and this is how someone is first incorporated into the church. The second sacrament is confirmation, and this completes the sacrament of baptism, typically through a profession of faith. Someone professes their faith, their faith to the church. The next is the Eucharist, and this is where things are going to get a little bit different depending on the resource that you're looking at, because some resources will say that all the sacraments are actually part of the Eucharist, and that this is the sacrament of communion or becoming one with Christ, things like that. So it depends on the resource here, all right? But what the Eucharist is the memorial of the death and resurrection of Christ. And typically, this is usually practiced through some form of offering and receiving by an individual. Sometimes this is typically through communion, all right? And this brings into elements of the Last Supper, the body and the blood of Christ, and things like that is the Eucharist, okay? Becoming one with Christ as one of the 7 sacraments. Continuing on, the 4th sacrament is going to be penance, confession of sins, and receiving a pardon through God's mercy. Next, we have the anointing of sick, which strengthens the faithful who are ill. The next is going to be marriage or matrimony, which is the binding or joining together of a couple in establishing a covenant, very similar to what you're going to see in different parts of the Bible, whether the Old Testament, the covenant between God and his chosen people, or the New Testament with Jesus and the covenant that he establishes with his church and his followers. And then finally, we have holy orders, where bishops or priests are ordained and able to carry out their sacred duties. Okay? And this is very much like what happened at the Last Supper with Jesus ordaining the apostles at the Last Supper. Now, even though I went through that order and said, this is the first sacrament, second, there isn't necessarily that same order. It doesn't necessarily have to go in that order, but a lot of times that might be the order, and especially for Christians, there is major events in one's life, baptism, going through confirmation, their first communion, things like that are major events in the lives of Christians, depending on branches, as we'll get into in just a minute. As far as symbolism goes with Christianity, the cross is one that is very, very identifiable for Christians worldwide. There are some different versions of the cross that you may see in different places in the world, and they tend to be associated more with different branches of Christianity. So the cross that you see down there at the bottom is the cross that's typically associated with Roman Catholicism. The branch in the upper right-hand corner is typically associated with Orthodox Christianity, so you have some additional crosses across the main bar of the cross. And then you have to look kind of closely, but on the church, you can see a more traditional Protestant cross, which tends to be just two single bars crossing. Okay? And as far as the history of Christianity, the cross is obviously, for those who are Christian, something that is very, very important in Christian history, because that is where Jesus was executed and then taken down from that, and later where he was resurrected. And there's a lot of that built into the sacraments and things like that. So there's a lot of crossover ties there. Okay. As far as architecture is concerned, the church is typically a place of worship, whereas a cathedral, and you can see the cathedral at Notre Dame there in the bottom right, is going to be the principal church of a diocese. And so a cathedral is going to be more associated with Roman Catholicism, whereas a church can be a place of worship in any different branch of Christianity. So let's go ahead and continue on by looking at our distribution of Christians worldwide and understanding the different branches that we see here. Christianity is the world's largest religion, with about 2 billion followers worldwide. Of that 2 billion, about half, about 1 billion people, are Roman Catholic. And we largely see Roman Catholic or Roman Catholicism in Southern and Western Europe and Latin America. Now, we have to understand where these different branches come from. So, Roman Catholicism is the oldest branch of Christianity, and Catholic just by itself translates to universal or throughout the whole, depending on the resource that you're using to translate that. But typically, universal is the one that is most commonly associated with Catholic. And so that is going to be a good piece of evidence as far as why Christianity is a universalizing religion, is because it was intended to be. It was something that anyone could be a part of. And so that is something that we're going to tend to see. As far as Roman Catholicism, the major elements of Roman Catholicism that define the branch are the teachings of the Bible and the interpretation of the Bible by the church hierarchy. Roman Catholicism is a very good example of a hierarchical religion. There is a hierarchy, and at the top of that hierarchy is the Pope. So the Pope can interpret the Bible, the teachings of the Bible, as kind of the Word of God. Orthodox Christianity split from Roman Catholicism beginning in about the 5th century is when that split started, and finished about 1054 is when it was largely kind of finalized. And Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox just by itself kind of means traditional. It means the more traditional aspects of a religion. And so they agree with Roman Catholicism on the sacraments and the traditional take of the Bible, but not the interpretation of the Bible by the Pope. So that's not something that Orthodox Christians are going to agree with. That's a difference. About 11% of the world identifies with Orthodox Christianity. 11% of the world's Christians identify with Orthodox Christianity. And it's largely in Eastern Europe and into Russia. Next, the newest branch, the youngest branch of Christianity is Protestantism, constituting about a quarter of the world's Christians in largely North America, Northern Europe, as well as Oceania. And the Protestant Reformation begins in the 16th century with Martin Luther. And for Protestants, they believe that, the sacraments, the 7 sacraments, are one element of religion, but that if you are going through the sacraments without the personal faith, without showing God love, if you're just kind of going through the motions, that's insufficient. That's not enough, right? And so they were protesting what they saw or what they perceived of the Catholic Church as just kind of going through the motions of going through these sacraments. And so that was a problem that the Protestants had. And there's a lot more detailed, more specific elements of that hopefully you guys will get in a world history class, because unfortunately we just don't have the time here. There's a lot more nuanced elements that Martin Luther was specifically objecting to. But largely it was, personal faith and personal salvation rather than going through the sacraments. All right, so the sacraments aren't quite as important to Protestants. As important. Doesn't mean that they're not important, just not as important. And so that's what we've got. And then we have other Christian churches that will constitute about 14%. Several different examples that might be mentioned from our textbook, Coptic Church, Armenian Christian Church, and things like that. All right, so taking a look at the birth and diffusion of Christianity, take a look at the early distribution. Very dispersed, using that geographic vocabulary, dispersed distribution. So the brown areas are the early distribution, very dispersed. All right, and the reason for that is that it was actually illegal throughout the Roman Empire to be Christian, to be a practicing Christian. And many Christians were persecuted, were executed as a result. Then the Emperor Constantine, in around the year 312, I believe it was, converted to Christianity. And then later, the religion was declared the religion of the Roman Empire. And so you can see kind of the progression, the change over time with that, as it's recognized, as it gains legal status, as it starts to be promoted by the empire. Now, one thing that this map doesn't show is the first country that officially converted to Christianity, and that was Armenia. So an important note to make, because it's not represented on this map, mainly just looks at the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire converting to Christianity is an important part of the Christian history. But another important part is the fact that Armenia was the first country to convert. But this is the area where all the divisions take place, the division between East and West, Eastern being Orthodox, Western being Catholic, between North and South, between the Northern Protestants and the Southern Catholics. So let's take a look at that. So here we go. Let's take a look. Let's ask the questions we always ask. First off, what type of map are we looking at? And at what scale are we examining this? This is a choropleth map, national scale. Let's understand our choropleth classes because we've got the green, and we got different shades of green for different denominations of the green are going to be Protestant branches, the Protestant branch. Pink is going to be our Catholic branch, and then orange is going to be our Orthodox branch. Now, here's the big question that I want you to have. Let's tie together language and religion. Because throughout much of Europe, we have Indo-European language spoken. So, for right now, this slide, tell me the branch of Indo-European that's spoken in the different areas where these religious branches are practiced. So what language branch is spoken with the areas that Protestantism dominates, what language branch is spoken where Catholicism dominates, and what language branch is spoken where Orthodox Christianity dominates. Let's make that connection. Those are important elements to make. All right? Next one, continuing on, and now we're going to break from looking at the history and the background with this to look at contemporary examples of this. Hey, take a look at the United States. Again, just like our world religion map, this is another core map that is fair game. Any question that comes from this map is fair game. Should be able to answer any question. All right, so this slide and the next slide are going to put these two together. So kind of draw an arrow between this slide and the next slide because we want to make sure that we understand this. All right, so first off, let's ask the question, what type of map are we looking at? And at what scale are we analyzing this? This is at the county scale. Hopefully you notice this. Choropleth map, yep, we got that. But county scale. All right, so let's break this down. Take a look in the southeast. That's red. That is the Baptist denomination of Protestantism. Right? The green that you see kind of there through the Midwest, Rust Belt, Corn Belt area, that's going to be Methodist. Then we have the kind of gold yellow in the northern border states. That's Lutheran. And if you go back to the last slide and you look at Northern Europe, take a look at the branch that you see up there. It's Lutheran. And remember, who moved to those northern border states, going back to our migration unit? Northern Europeans. So they brought with them their religion. What is that an example of? Relocation diffusion. They're bringing it with them. It showed up here as people brought their religion with them. Out west, that brown, that tan color, that's going to be LDS. It's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or you might see it labeled as Mormons. And then the bluish purple that you see there is going to be Catholic. So this is looking at the largest religious group by county throughout the country. Right? So let's take a look at some of the ways that we could label this. So again, we pointed out in the south and southeast, Baptist dominates in the Midwest, Great Plains, Rust Belt, Corn Belt, not as clustered, much more dispersed distribution for Methodists. Northern border states, your Wisconsin, your Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, Lutherans. Out west, not West Coast, but out west, Utah, Idaho, Nevada, Mormon or LDS, Latter-day Saints. Everywhere else, Catholic. All right. Now, if you were to look at that map and I were to ask you, what is the largest religious group in the United States, what might you say? And students in the past, looking at that map, looking at all that blue, all that purple, the fact that I say here, everywhere else is Catholic, most people are going to say Catholic. It's not Catholic. So let's look at the numbers. This is looking at the percentage of people who identify with different religions in the United States. So I want you guys to go ahead and pause the video right now. Take a look at these numbers, okay? And I just want you to jot down observations, notes, things of interest, questions that you have. Maybe there's some terms on here that you're not quite sure about. So take a look at some of these and break it down. What are some of the questions that you have? Because this gets into a lot more detail than maybe we need to for the AP exam, but it shows the religious diversity of our country. All right? Yes, our country is 78% Christian, but when we look at it, there's a lot of diversity in that 78%. All right? So that's important to understand. What are some notes, observations, questions that you have as you take a look at this? I'm going to ask that same question on this slide as well. So before we do that, as always, what type of map are we looking at and at what scale? And this is a choropleth map, county scale in the United States. All right. But this is different than the last religion map that we looked at. This is not a core map. This is looking at religious adherents, religious followers. The number of people who are followers of a religion as a percentage of all residents of the county. All right. So what we're seeing are the counties that are more devout. The number of counties that where larger numbers of people are followers. Larger percentages of people are followers of a religion. All right. So the darker shade, the higher the percentage. The lighter the shade, the lower the percentage. So again, I want to ask you guys, pause this, take a look at this for a minute. All right. What questions do you have? What impacts do a higher or lower percentage of adherents have on a community? If a vast majority of people not only practice a particular religion, but that the vast majority of people practice that religion, what is that? What are you going to see in that community? How is that going to impact the cultural landscape? How is it going to look different? How is it going to maybe look the same? So think about that. Brainstorm some ideas. What are some things that are going to come out of this map when we compare it to the last map? Last slide with regards to religion here in the United States is taking a look at trends with religious affiliation in the United States. So the first question that I have for you on here is, what trend do you notice? What trend do you notice? We've got numbers. We also have a graph over here. So what trend do you notice? Then, do you think this trend is going to continue? Why or why not? What do we think with this? Then, the trend, if we take a look at this, is that the number of people who are adherents, who are followers of a religion, who adhere to a religion, are declining, generally speaking. All right? Because some religious faiths are increasing in the United States. Unaffiliated, what we classified as non-religious last unit, because you see on here, we have atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular, lumped in with unaffiliated. We called it non-religious last lecture, is increasing. So, if this trend continues, what changes? The last slide I asked, if you see a lot of people who are adherents, what's that community going to look like? What's the impact it's going to have on the community? What's the impact it's going to have on the cultural landscape? Now, let's flip it. If this trend continues, how does the cultural landscape change? How do communities change as a result? And the reality is, I don't know the answer. We don't know what's going to happen. But thinking about that, thinking about the impact that religion has on the landscape is important. All right, let's shift gears into our next universalizing religion, and that is Islam. So here we go with our definition. As always with these definitions, you should be underlining important parts. How are you going to remember the difference between Islam from Christianity from Buddhism? Gotta underline important parts. Here it is. A monotheistic, universalizing religion that is based on the teachings of Muhammad. According to Islamic teachings, Muhammad received the truth directly from Allah in a series of revelations during which Muhammad spoke the verses of the Quran, the Islamic holy book. Now you'll notice there's two different spellings of Quran. Just be aware, you may see it either way. And as always, anytime you're going to translate something from one language to another, and in this case from one alphabet to another, there's going to be variations in spelling, pronunciation, as we're going to see as we go through this. All right. Just like we did with Buddhism and Christianity, a little bit of background. Okay, the origins of Islam begin with Muhammad, who was born in the year 570 of the Common Era in Mecca in what is now modern-day Saudi Arabia. At the age of 40, he received his first message from Allah through the archangel Gabriel, or Jibril, depending on, once again, translations, things like that. In the year 622, after a lot of persecution, Muhammad was commanded to move to Yathrib. Yathrib was then later renamed Medina, which translates to the city of the prophet. Great example of how religion impacts the landscape, the evidence of how religion impacts a particular place. The fact that they renamed a city, and we can see that in Christianity, we can see that in other religions as well, but we can see it here again with the city of the prophet, Medina. So let's go ahead and take a look, start filling out our baseball card, as it were. Major aspects of Islam. The holy text is the Quran. All right, and the Quran was the messages directly from the archangel Gabriel, from Allah to Muhammad, and it was passed down. Muhammad memorized the Quran and passed it down, and later it was written down into an actual holy text. Another major element of Islam are the 5 pillars, in much the same way that we had the 4 noble truths and the Eightfold Path with Buddhism, the 7 sacraments with Christianity. For Islam, we have the 5 pillars. So here are the 5 pillars of Islam. The first is the testimony of faith. Right? And the testimony of faith, again, depending on, there's going to be a lot of different variations, but the testimony of faith roughly goes to the effect of there is no true God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger or prophet of God. Okay? And this is typically seen as the most important pillar of Islam, because it is how someone becomes Muslim, and a Muslim is one who submits to the will of Allah, and the testimony of faith is that submission, is submitting to the will of Allah, submitting to the will of God. The second pillar is prayer, which is done 5 times daily in the direction of Mecca, and it's done at dawn, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and nighttime. 5 times daily. The third pillar is charity, and charity is helping out the less fortunate, providing for the less fortunate. It is an act of purification where one purifies themselves by providing for the needy. Fourth pillar is fasting during the holy month of Ramadan. Muslims will fast from dawn until sunset. Once again, is an act of purification, an act of understanding, of sympathy, of empathy for those who struggle, for those who go hungry, and understanding pain and suffering. And then the fifth pillar, the final pillar of Islam, is a pilgrimage to Mecca once during every Muslim's life. This is known as the Hajj. And so once during their lifetime. Okay, they may go more than once, but once during their lifetime, so long as they are physically and financially able to. All right? And we're going to talk about the differences in the branches here in just a minute. But the five pillars and how important they are differ by branch in much the same way that the seven sacraments differ by branch in Christianity as well. Okay. Other major elements of Islam as far as architecture is concerned, you're not going to see the human form depicted. So you're going to see a lot more geometric patterns associated with Islam, decorating Islamic architecture and things like that. The crescent moon and star sometimes is associated with Islam. However, it's important to understand the history behind the crescent moon and star. It was a symbol of the Ottoman Empire. So while the Ottoman Empire was a Muslim empire, it wasn't explicitly a symbol associated with Islam. It was associated with the empire and has later on become a symbol for Islam or been used with Islam. Not every scholar, not every Muslim accepts this as a symbol for Islam, but you will see it used. So just be aware that that is something that if you see it, might be depicting something that relates to Islam, but the absence of the crescent moon and star doesn't necessarily mean the absence of Muslim population or Islam or things like that. As far as architecture is concerned, the mosque is the holy building where people will gather. It's also a community gathering place. So a mosque typically is going to be set up near the center of a city. It's going to be easily accessible. And then another really important element of Islamic architecture, you can see it in the image there, are minarets. These are these towers that were historically used to call people to prayer. All right? During those 5 times of daily prayer, someone would go up into the tower, up into the minaret, and call people to prayer. These are still used to this day, and very distinctive element. It's easily recognizable because, as you can see, it rises up above the cityscape. So very, very recognizable. One really easy way to identify areas where there might be a large Muslim population because of the presence of minarets. So again, if we're identifying the cultural landscape, this could help. As far as the current distribution of Muslims worldwide, 1.3 billion people. It is the world's second largest religion behind Christianity. The vast majority of people who are Muslim are Sunni Muslims, and the Sunni branch of Islam, 83% of the population, and roughly translates to people of the tradition of Muhammad and the consensus. So the split that took place between the Sunnis and Shiites, or Shia, dealt with the succession after the Prophet Muhammad passed away. And the Sunnis believed that it should be someone who is chosen to lead. So after Muhammad passed away, Abu Bakr was chosen. And Abu Bakr was one of Muhammad's closest companions, was an Islamic scholar, knew the religion and the religious teachings, in the opinion of the people who chose him, better than anyone else. And so he was chosen as the first caliph or successor to the prophet. Then, during a series after Muhammad, Muhammad's closest male heir, Ali, was chosen as the fourth caliph. However, here's the problem. Shias believed that it should have been, and it should have remained, the organization, the leadership should have remained with Muhammad's family. So where Sunnis believed that it should have been, a person chosen to lead, Shias believe that it should have been Muhammad's family that led. And Ali was his closest male relative. It was his son-in-law. And so Shias rejected the fact that anyone other than Ali would be the rightful successor to Muhammad. So that's where the split took place, very, very early on. And it dealt with the succession after Muhammad. Okay? Now, again, Sunnis, you're going to see the 5 pillars of Islam, but Shias, the 5 pillars aren't quite as important. And instead, there's a different number associated with the Shias, and that is 12, a plan of 12, or the 12th Imam is something that is especially important for Shias, believing that, someone who is almost viewed as a messiah is going to return. So, similarities there across universalizing religions, in the concept of a messiah returning and things like that. Okay. As far as the distributions, the Middle East is one that is certainly associated with Islam, from North Africa into Southwest Asia, as well as Central Asia. Don't forget Central Asia. Okay, but outside of the Middle East, more than half of the world's Muslims live in just 4 countries. And those countries, in order, will go Indonesia, the most populous Muslim country on earth, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. The 4 most populous Muslim countries on earth. Now, not so much dealing with the religion, but this is a common misconception, so it's something that I'd like to address. Now, we haven't talked about ethnicity yet. It's coming up. But I want you to understand that the term Muslim and the term Arab are not synonymous. They don't mean the same thing. All right? Arab is an ethnicity. It's cultural background. We're going to talk about that. A Muslim is a follower of Islam, one who submits to the will of Allah. So, 90% of all Arabs are Muslim. You can see in the overlapping kind of Venn diagram thing that's going on here. Yet 90% of the world's Arabs are Muslim. However, 80% of the world's Muslims aren't Arab. And so that's something that we have to be able to differentiate. Okay? That we have to understand the terms that are used. And that's where things get especially complicated and people get confused. So taking a look at the birth and diffusion of Islam, we can see that it began in what is now modern-day Saudi Arabia. And modern-day Saudi Arabia still remains a really important part of the religion because, part of the 5 pillars are, once during a Muslim's life, returning to or going to Mecca as part of the Hajj, right? And that is in Saudi Arabia. And Islam diffused very, very quickly over a very large geographic area. But you'll notice there that to a certain extent it receded because like in India, it didn't remain. But there was still a legacy because, again, India is one of the most populous Muslim countries on earth, as is Bangladesh, Pakistan, same area. But you'll notice it diffused very, very quickly, very wide geographic area. Because it began in the Arabian Peninsula. You can see it made its way all the way to what is now modern-day Indonesia that still has an impact to this day. And so that's an important point to make. Next one is looking at religious divisions, because we pointed out in the last lecture that Iran is the largest predominantly Shia country on earth. But I want to take a look at some of the boundaries that have existed, both political boundaries drawn by colonial powers and religious boundaries that existed long before those colonial powers were there. All right? And this is a great example of superimposed boundaries. Now, we haven't defined superimposed boundaries yet. We'll talk about that in political geography, but please do write it down because this is a good example of it. A superimposed boundary is a boundary line placed over and ignoring an existing cultural boundary. So take a look here. The country of Iraq, the boundary that was drawn there, included areas that are Kurdish, which is a particular ethnicity, okay, an area that is Sunni, and an area that is Shia. When we take a look at Syria, Syria has an area that is Kurdish, has an area that is Sunni, and an area that is Alawites. Now, Alawites are a sect that broke away from the Shia branch, okay, and actually is a good example of syncretism because they combined certain elements of like Christianity were brought in to form a completely new element, which are called Alawites. And current events brought into this, Bashar al-Assad, who is the leader in Syria, is an Alawite. And only about 10% of the Syrian population is Alawite. And so when we take a look at this, the question that I want to pose is more of a hypothetical question, rhetorical question, if you were. And that is, would there be as much conflict if boundary lines were drawn to accommodate religious and cultural groups, religion, ethnicity, things like that, rather than, staking claims to colonial land and things like that? I don't know. It's a rhetorical question. We'll never know the answer to that because what has happened has happened. But it's at least an interesting question to think about, to ponder on. And I leave you with that. All right. That's the last slide for Islam. We have one last quick slide for universal. For universalizing religion is Sikhism. Sikhism is a universalizing religion largely found in Pakistan and India. And as we have done with our other universalizing religions, let's create our baseball card, as it were. So as far as the origins, Nanak is the creator, lived in Pakistan, combined elements of Islam and Hinduism together, so a really good example of syncretism, taking elements from two different culture groups, combining them, creating something new, and that religion is Sikhism. One of the core elements of Sikhism is that there is a supreme being, a single supreme being, who is the creator, and that creator is perfect. And we work towards becoming perfect like that creator. And since it is a single supreme being, that means that we could label Sikhism as monotheistic. As far as major aspects, things that are really identifiable with Sikhism, you can see the Golden Temple there in the top right. That is in India, specifically in the Punjab region of India. One of the sacred sites, the most sacred site for Sikhs worldwide. The Khanda that you see over there on the right is the symbol associated with Sikhism, and in much the same way that the Wheel of Dharma for Buddhism, the cross for Christianity, the crescent moon and star for Islam is a symbol for the religion, so too is the Khanda. As far as culture traits typically associated with Sikhism, it's not universal, but typically associated with it. Men will not cut their hair or beards, so you'll see long beards. You'll see men who cover their hair with turbans, and that is a culture trait typically associated with Sikhism. So that's something that you may see as something fairly identifiable and important for Sikhs worldwide. As far as the distribution, it's largely clustered near the Hearth, near Pakistan, where it began, and most of the world's Sikhs live in the Punjab region, which is in the northwest part of India, bordering on Pakistan. 23 million Sikhs worldwide, 20 million of which live in the Punjab region of India. So that concludes our universalizing religion discussion. I know it was an extra long lecture, so I appreciate your time and patience and listening to all this detail because there was a lot to get through, but very, very important. So I will see you guys next time in class. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.